A poor orphan risks her own life to save a dying stranger from a lethal snake bite, never imagining he is a billionaire titan of industry. But when his family returns to claim the savior as his bride, her wicked aunt weaves a web of greed, replacing the orphan with her own daughter. Now the true savior is hidden away in the fields, while an impostor wears her crown and claims her reward. Will the truth ever emerge from the shadows? Will a heart forged in sacrifice find its way back to the man she saved? This is a story of ultimate betrayal, a stolen identity, and a final shattering chance at destiny. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. Chakotay, get to the farm and harvest the yams before I lose my patience. Or do you want us to starve today? The scream of Aunt Osa's tore through the dusty compound like a physical slap. Chakotay didn't answer. She couldn't. It wasn't that she hadn't heard her aunt's voice echoing from the veranda, but simply that her body was too broken to react. Her feet were a map of aches, her palms were raw and sore, and a hollow hunger had been rumbling in her stomach since yesterday afternoon. She stood for a moment, looking at her tattered clothes and thinking of the life she once had in the city. A life of neat braids, soft yam, and egg stew that vanished the day her parents never came home. With a heavy sigh, she reached for her faded woven basket, threw it over her aching arm, and began the long walk toward the farm path like a prisoner heading into exile. The sun was already a punishing weight against her brown skin, but the true ache was in her chest, the feeling of a girl whose destiny had been buried in the dirt. Little did she know, her life was about to collide with a dying man and a billionaire's promise. The scream of Aunt Osa's continued to ring in the quiet morning air like a jagged blade, shattering the fragile peace of the dawn. Chakotay did not flinch. She had long since learned that in this house, silence was her only shield, even if it could not protect her from the stinging weight of her aunt's insults. She was a girl who lived in the hollow space between a memory of love and a reality of servitude. As she trudged forward, her mind involuntarily drifted back to a time when her world didn't smell of wood smoke and dust, but of a city flat that felt like a fortress. In those distant days, Chakotay carried a purple backpack instead of a farm basket. She had parents who looked at her as if she were the center of the universe, encouraging her to study hard and dream of a life filled with purpose. But the road back from a wedding had become a road to an end, and at just 14, a car crash had stolen the only hands that ever held her with tenderness. With no siblings and no other sanctuary, she was handed over to her father's older brother, Uncle Joe. At first, the village setting had seemed like a temporary resting place where Aunt Osa's offered matching dresses and hot meals alongside her cousin Rita. But as soon as the bank account her father had painstakingly built ran dry, the magic of that welcome curdled into a bitter daily poison. Aunt Osa's had transformed from a welcoming relative into a relentless taskmaster, who seemed to find personal offense in Chakotay's very existence. "Do I look like I picked you from a dustbin?" she would hiss, her eyes darting with predatory greed. Under Osa's roof, Chakotay was no longer a niece. She was a lost goat, a washerwoman, a sweeper of compounds who was expected to be invisible until she was needed for labor. The most painful blow, however, had come when school resumed. While Rita prepared to join the village secondary school, swinging her backpack with the arrogance of the favored, Osa's had blocked the doorway, her arms folded across her chest like iron bars. She had made it clear that they were not a charity home, and that there would be no school fees for a girl who was meant for winnowing rice and fetching water. Chakotay's heart had shattered that day, though she had learned to keep her tears internal, knowing that crying was merely an invitation for another slap. Now, as she walked the narrow path toward the farm, the dust curling around her ankles felt like a physical manifestation of her buried dreams. She watched from afar as Rita lived the life that should have been shared, painting her nails and laughing at Chakotay's torn slippers. The insults were a constant background noise, a daily dose of insults that she collected like a meager salary. She thought of her mother and father, wondering if they could see her now, a girl with sore palms and a rumbling stomach, heading into the bush like an exile. The farm path was a lonely stretch between tall, whispering bushes, a place where the heat of the sun beat down with an unforgiving intensity. To Chakotay, This path was a journey into a world that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. She thought about the education she had lost, the science books she used to devour, and the future that seemed to be slipping away with every tuber of yam she harvested. She was tired, tired in her bones, tired in her soul, and yet she kept walking, driven by a survival instinct that her aunt could not quite extinguish. The insults of the morning still echoed in her ears. If you're not sweeping, you're washing. And if you're not washing, you're just there looking like a lost goat. Chakotay tightened her grip on the basket. She didn't know that today, the path would offer more than just dust and labor. She didn't know that she was walking toward a moment of life and death, one that would test the quiet bravery she had forged in the fire of her aunt's cruelty. For now, she was simply the orphan girl, carrying the weight of a life that had become a nightmare of lost identity. The sun was a blistering eye in the center of the sky as Chakotay made her way deeper into the farm path, the dust curling around her ankles like restless spirits. Her mind was a whirlpool of if-onlys. If only her parents hadn't entered that car, if only death had asked for permission first, perhaps she wouldn't be wandering this lonely stretch of land with a heart full of ash. She was halfway through the narrow corridor between two tall, whispering bushes when her pace faltered. A figure lay sprawled in the middle of the dirt path. At first, her weary eyes tricked her into thinking it was a discarded sack of cassava, but as she drew closer, the basket fell from her hand, the hollow thud echoing against the silence. A man lay there, his shirt soaked in the cold sweat of agony, his leg twisted at a strange, unnatural angle. Chakotay dropped to her knees beside him, her sore palms pressing into the hot earth as she took in his clammy skin and pale lips. Then she saw the marks, two sharp, angry puncture wounds on his lower leg, already beginning to swell into a dark, bruised mass. Snake bite. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She looked around frantically, but there was no one, just the buzzing of flies and the indifferent heat. In that moment, the years of social worker empathy she had observed in her parents and the survival instincts forged under Aunt Osa's cruelty collided. Instinct took over. Chakotay reached for the cloth tied around her waist and yanked it free, binding it tight above the wound to slow the spread of the venom, a technique she had memorized from the science books her aunt had forbidden her from reading. She didn't hesitate. She didn't allow herself to think of the risk. Lowering her head, she pressed her lips to the man's skin and began to suck the poison from the wound, spitting the bitter metallic fluid onto the dusty path again and again. Her stomach turned with the taste of copper and death, but she remained unwavering in her sacrifice. When she could do no more, she grunted with effort, dragging the man's limp arm over her shoulder. She was a girl weakened by hunger, yet she found a terrifying strength, half carrying and half dragging the stranger toward the road, praying for a vehicle that never came. Desperation drove her the rest of the way to the village clinic. She burst through the doors, her voice cracking as she screamed for help. Snake bite. Somebody, please. Nurses rushed out, lifting the unconscious man onto a gurney, but as they wheeled him away, the progress of mercy stopped abruptly. Wait, where is the deposit slip? The matron asked, her voice cold and professional. She demanded a 5,000 naira deposit before any anti-venom could be administered. Chakotay panicked, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Please, he is dying. I will bring the money, she begged, but the matron was unyielding, stating that the clinic was not a charity home. Chakotay didn't argue. She bolted out the door, her tired legs finding a new gear of urgency. She ran straight to the home of Grace, her only true friend in the village. Grace was in the backyard, her rhythmic pounding of yams stopping as Chakotay appeared, breathless and wild-eyed. Grace, please. I need 5,000 naira. A man is dying. Without a single question, Grace dropped the pestle and ran inside, returning with the crumpled notes. Please bring it back, Chakotay, Grace whispered. That is my mama's pepper soup money. Chakotay promised she would, her throat tight with gratitude, before dashing back to the clinic to hand over the funds. Only after the nurses began the treatment did Chakotay remember the yams she was supposed to have harvested. By the time she returned to the compound, the sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. She held only 2 small tubers, her arms aching from the weight of the man she had saved. Aunt Osa's was waiting by the gate, her voice cutting through the evening air like a bullet, accusing her of frolicking with village boys. Chakotay dropped the basket at the kitchen door, panting, unable to explain the life-saving sacrifice she had just made. As she turned to start dinner, she felt a shift in her soul. She didn't know the man's name, didn't know he was Chucksobina, a billionaire whose destiny was now irrevocably tied to her own, but she knew that she had risked everything for a stranger, and in the darkness of her aunt's house, that spark of goodness was the only thing that kept her from shattering. The next morning, just as the village sun started to rise lazily above the coconut trees, Chakotay made her way toward the community tap, her legs still sore from the previous day's rescue. But her mind wasn't on the heavy jerry cans or the breakfast she hadn't eaten. It was on the man at the clinic. She had barely slept, wondering if the anti-venom had worked and if he would even remember her face. Driven by a quiet compulsion, she hurried toward the hospital, her slippers dragging on the tiled floor as she tiptoed into the small, quiet room. He was awake, his eyes fluttering open with a drowsy, pale exhaustion. Chakotay knelt beside the bed and whispered her name, reminding him that she was the one who found him on the farm path. He muttered something incoherent, a gibberish of sounds that died as he drifted back into sleep, but the rise and fall of his chest was steady enough to offer her a fleeting sense of peace. Day after day, Chakotay returned, sneaking away from Aunt Osa's watchful eyes to sit beside the stranger. She brought him what little food she could scavenge, gari, okra soup, or just water and bread, wiping the sweat from his forehead and whispering that he was going to be fine. One afternoon, his eyes finally held a spark of clarity. He rasped a single word, phone. Chakotay begged the clinic staff until they relented, placing a device in his weak grip so he could dial a number from memory. She stepped out of the room to give him privacy, never hearing the conversation and never imagining that she was standing on the threshold of a different world. That evening, the quiet hospital compound erupted in a chaos of revving engines and rising dust. 3 black, tinted jeeps pulled into the lot, looking like shiny foreign intruders in the village dirt. Men in dark suits jumped out with practiced precision, their earpieces glinting in the sun while the clinic staff froze in disbelief. They marched through the hallways like royalty, demanding to see their boss, Chucksobina, the CEO of the Kenland Group. The village doctor's eyes widened as if he had been slapped with a checkbook. The man who had been lying in Ward 3, the stranger Chakotay had dragged through the bush, was a billionaire titan of industry. In a whirlwind of convoy dust and drama, the PA and manager handed over envelopes of cash and checked vitals while the clinic erupted in whispers. Chuck's voice came out faintly from the bed, asking for the girl who had brought him there, but his people were in too much of a hurry. "You can thank her later," the nurse urged, lifting him into the car with the 4 still running. They drove off, leaving behind nothing but the smell of expensive exhaust and a stunned silence. When Chakotay finally arrived at the gate with a bowl of beans and plantain, her heart dropped. The room was open and empty. The nurse sighed, telling her that the big people had come in a convoy to carry their billionaire back to the city. Chakotay stood there, blinking, the weight of the bowl in her hands feeling like a useless burden. He was gone, and he hadn't said goodbye. She felt empty as she walked straight to Grace's house, where her friend was outside washing clothes. When Chakotay shared the news, Grace threw her hands up in frustration. "Just like that? What about our 5,000 naira?" she cried, thinking of her mother's pepper soup money. Chakotay nodded calmly, though her chest ached. "I'll pay you back," she promised, her voice a soft, hollow echo. "Bit by bit, I'll do small farm work and chores. He's alive, and that's what matters." She returned to the compound that evening to find Aunt Osa's waiting with her usual daily dose of insults. "If you like, roam the whole village," Osa's hissed, mocking her dirty appearance and ordering her into the kitchen to warm the soup. Chakotay took the verbal lashings like a salary, her body too tired to fight back as she fetched water in the dark. She had saved a billionaire and was left with nothing but a debt to her only friend and the same torn slippers on her feet. As sleep finally took her on her tiny, dark mattress, she whispered into the shadows that life would go on. She had no idea that in a city mansion filled with marble floors and soft music, Chuck Sobina was waking up with her name on his lips, or that destiny was already shifting gears to bring the shadows of the village into the light of his world. Back in the city, Chuck Sobina was admitted to the finest hospital money could buy, a facility of glass doors and soft jazz where the air smelled of expensive furniture rather than antiseptic. Machines beeped softly in a VIP suite designed for national treasures, and private nurses rotated in shifts around the clock. His mother, Mama Loveth, had arrived like a hurricane of relief, her wrapper nearly falling as she wailed in gratitude that her son had survived the venom of his enemies. Beside her, Chief Andrew stood by the window with red eyes, his silent presence speaking of a father's terror and relief. The city doctors were blunt about the miracle they were witnessing. They adjusted their glasses and told the family that if the girl in the village hadn't intervened with such quiet bravery, Chucks would have surely lost his leg, if not his life. For days, Chucks was pampered like a prince, but every time the room grew quiet, his mind drifted away from the luxury and back to the farm path. He could still feel the trembling hands of the girl who had knelt in the dust to save him. He remembered her soft voice, the way she had fanned him with her own scarf when he was drifting in and out of consciousness, and the faint scent of ash and palm oil that clung to her. She was the only person who had seen him not as a billionaire CEO, but as a dying man in need of mercy. One morning, after he had regained enough energy to sit up and look out over the city skyline, he called for his inner circle. Adebayo, his loyal personal assistant, and Laurenta, his sharp-eyed manager, stood at the foot of his bed, pens ready to take down corporate instructions. But the decree Chucks issued had nothing to do with the Kenland Group or market shares. He looked at them with a clarity that brooked no argument and told them to go back to the village. "Find the girl who saved me," he commanded, his voice firm despite his lingering weakness. "Her name is Chakotay. Bring her to me. I want to marry her." Adebayo's eyes widened in shock, wondering if his boss was still suffering from the lingering effects of the venom, but Chucks doubled down, reminding them that she had sucked the poison from his very veins. He didn't want a city socialite or a strategic alliance. He wanted the girl who had risked her life for a stranger. And just like that, the mission began. While Chucks continued his recovery, Laurenta and Adebayo prepared for the journey, fueled by their boss's unwavering resolve. Chucks refused to listen to his mother's protests that he was being too hasty or his father's advice about the scandal a village marriage might create among the city elite. To Chucks, it was a simple matter of a life owed and a heart found. He spent his hours in the hospital suite dreaming of the girl with the rough, tired palms, unaware that his decree had set a collision course with a web of greed he could not yet see. In the village, the hot afternoon breeze continued to blow lazily through the bushes, and Chakotay remained trapped in her daily routine of labor and insults, oblivious to the fact that her name was being spoken in high-rise offices. She was still focused on the 5,000 naira debt she owed Grace, doing extra weeding and farm work bit by bit to pay for the anti-venom that had saved a man she thought she would never see again. She accepted her daily dose of insults from Aunt Osa's like a meager salary, unaware that the black SUVs were already being fueled for the journey that would change everything. Chucks had made his choice, and Laurenta and Adebayo were the instruments of a destiny that was about to shift gears, heading straight for Uncle Joe's compound with the promise of a crown and the threat of a betrayal. The arrival of the emissaries was heralded by a cloud of red dust that hung in the air like a shimmering veil. Two sleek, black SUVs glided through the narrow village roads, their polished surfaces reflecting the tropical sun with an intensity that forced the locals to shield their eyes. As the convoy rolled into Uncle Joe's compound, chickens scattered in terror and neighbors peered through the gaps in their zinc fences, whispering about politicians and election periods. Adebayo and Laurenta stepped out of the vehicles, their tailored city suits looking like foreign armor against the rustic backdrop of the village. Aunt Osa's emerged from the kitchen, wiping groundnut sauce onto her wrapper, her eyes bulging with a mixture of shock and sudden, sharp-edged greed. Adebayo stepped forward, offering a formal greeting that masked his discomfort with the rural heat. He wasted no time in revealing their mission. They were from the city, sent by Chuck Sobina, the CEO of the Kenland Group. He explained that a girl from this compound had saved Chucks from a deadly snake bite, and because she had risked her life for him, their boss intended to thank her personally, by making her his wife. Laurenta added calmly that they were there to collect the bride price list, as Chucks was ready to marry her immediately. The information hit Osas like kerosene on dry grass. For a split second, the world stood still as the sheer magnitude of the opportunity sank in. She grabbed Uncle Joe's arm and dragged him inside the house, her eyes wild with a frantic, desperate plan. "Obi, this is a golden opportunity," she hissed behind the closed door, her voice trembling with the weight of the riches she could almost taste. When Joe hesitated, noting that the men had specifically come for their niece, Chakotay, Osas shut him down with a snarl. Chakotay was currently at the community tap, invisible and expendable. Rita was right there. They were the same size, the same age, and as far as the city people knew, one village girl looked just like another. "Let Rita pretend to be Chakotay," Osas whispered, her mind racing through the logistics of the fraud. She ignored Joe's weak protests about the morality of the act, reminding him of their dead motorcycle and the leaking roof that had plagued them for years. She called Rita into the room, gripping her daughter's shoulders with a ferocity that left no room for argument. "This is your destiny," she told the girl. "You will wear Chakotay's clothes. You will speak softly like her. You will be the one who saved the billionaire." Rita, biting her nails in a fit of nerves, asked what would happen if Chucks found out, but Osas waved the fear away. The man had been unconscious and heavily sedated. He hadn't truly seen her face. Minutes later, Rita walked out onto the veranda, dressed in Chakotay's faded wrapper, her eyes cast downward in a mimicry of shy virtue. Adebayo and Laurenta, having no reason to doubt the family, nodded in approval. They collected the bride price list that very hour, unaware that the real savior was currently balancing 2 heavy jerry cans of water on her head, completely oblivious to the theft of her future. When Chakotay eventually returned from the tap, she sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The compound was strangely quiet, and her aunt's usual explosive temper had been replaced by a hushed, sugary sweetness that felt like a trap. Osas peeked through the door, telling Chakotay to rest because they would need her to clear the farm the next morning. For the next few days, conversations remained hushed and plans were made in the shadows. On the day of the ceremony, Osas ensured Chakotay was far from the compound. She woke the girl before dawn, ordering her to take a cutlass and clear the back farm before the sun grew too hot. Once that was done, Chakotay was instructed to head to Chief Oike's farm to weed for a meager 3,000 naira. While Chakotay labored in the forest, her skin itching from thorny cassava leaves and her throat parched with thirst, the compound was transformed. Canopies were raised, city caterers set up their stands, and Joe and Osas adorned themselves in expensive lace and heavy coral beads, playing the roles of the proud parents of the bride. The wedding took place in a whirlwind of music and celebration, all without Chakotay's knowledge. As she trudged home later that evening, her feet dragging over the dusty path, she was met by her friend Grace, who was breathless with shock. "Didn't you hear? Your cousin got married today. Rich people came with jeeps." Grace cried. Chakotay's heart paused, her throat tightening as she realized she hadn't even been worth an invitation. A fleet of black SUVs swept past her on the road, kicking up a haze of red dust that forced her to step aside. She watched the convoy disappear toward the city, never realizing that the man in the back seat was the stranger she had saved, and the girl beside him was a thief wearing her crown. When she finally entered the compound, she found it littered with empty chairs and drink bottles. Her aunt, shimmering in gold lace, didn't offer a word of comfort. Instead, she sneered at Chakotay's dirt-stained appearance and told her she better look for her own husband because their time for accommodating her was running out. Osas barked an order for Chakotay to clean the dustbin of a compound, leaving the orphan to sweep up the remnants of a party for a life that should have been hers. A few days had passed since the secret wedding in the village, and the mansion in the city was a hive of anticipation. Chucks Obinna, though still under the watchful eye of his doctors, could not stop smiling. The sterile scent of the hospital had been replaced by the fragrance of fresh lilies and the promise of seeing his savior again. His PA, Adebayo, joked about his sudden change in temperament, and even Mama Loveth noticed how her son's eyes sparkled whenever the name Chakotay was mentioned. To Chucks, this wasn't just a marriage. It was a debt of life being repaid with a heart of gold. He dreamt of the girl who had knelt in the dirt, the one whose quiet bravery had reached into the jaws of death to pull him back. Meanwhile, Rita was already drowning in the intoxicating benefits of her mother's deception. Within the walls of the Obina mansion, staff members bowed as she walked past, and the massive refrigerators were filled with every luxury she had once only seen in magazines. New clothes were delivered daily, silks, chiffons, and lace that made her forget the torn slippers she had left in the village dust. She paraded through the house like a queen who had always belonged there, her dressing table overflowing with makeup kits, gold jewelry, and expensive perfumes that masked her true identity. The day of Chuck's official discharge finally arrived. As he stepped through the front doors of his home, his heart hammered against his ribs in a rhythm of pure excitement. He adjusted his collar, took a deep breath, and prepared to look into the eyes of the girl who had given him a second chance at destiny. He stepped into the sprawling living room, his eyes searching for the humble village girl he remembered. Instead, Rita came rushing forward, a vision of heavy makeup and a fitted gown that clung to her in ways the girl on the farm path would never have imagined. The air around her was thick with a choking cloud of expensive perfume. Chuck's smile froze. His steps halted abruptly, and without thinking, he instinctively took a step back as if recoiling from a stranger. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice stunned and devoid of the warmth he had been saving for his bride. Rita looked confused, spreading her arms and insisting she was his wife, the one he had asked his family to marry. Mama Loveth stepped forward, sensing the sudden sharp tension in the air, and tried to calm him by confirming that this was indeed the girl from the village, the one they were told was Chakotay. Chucks turned sharply to his mother, his face twisting with a growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. "Mom, this is not her," he stated firmly. "I don't know this girl. She is not the one who saved me." The room fell into a deathly silence. Rita dropped to her knees, weeping and begging him to remember how she had supposedly cleaned his wound and taken him to the hospital. But Chucks barked for her to stop, his eyes flashing with a cold, clinical fire. He turned away and climbed the stairs without another word, leaving the impostor sobbing on the marble floor. In the sanctuary of his room, Chucks buried his face in his hands, the weight of the betrayal sitting heavily on his chest. His memory might have been clouded by venom and sedation, but his soul remembered what his eyes had missed. The girl who had saved him had soft, tired eyes and a quiet, melodic voice. Her palms were rough from labor, not smooth from city lotions. Most importantly, he remembered the scent of her, a scent of wood smoke, ash, and palm oil that no amount of expensive perfume could ever replicate. Later that night, Mama Loveth knocked gently on his door, arguing that he might be being too harsh. She reminded him that he was heavily sedated in the clinic and wondered if his memory was simply playing tricks on him. Chuck sat up, his voice calm but immovable. He told her that even if he had been drugged, he could never forget the way the real girl had fanned him with her scarf and fed him Gary when he was at his weakest. He knew with a bone-deep conviction that the woman downstairs was an imposter. As the weeks passed, the mansion became a place of cold, suffocating silence. Chucks avoided Rita like a plague, refusing to eat the meals she cooked or wear the clothes she laid out. He watched her from a distance, seeing the fake nails and the filtered photos, and felt a growing sense of suffocation. His father, Chief Andrew, tried to advise him to live with it, fearing the scandal of returning a bride to a titled family like Uncle Joe's. But Chuck's jaw only tightened. He had been deceived, and he would not let a stolen identity become his reality. Deep in the night, he decided that he would go back to the village alone, without the convoy or the suits, to find the truth for himself. The ride back from the city was a journey into a growing, heavy silence. 4 months after the wedding that felt more like a burial, Chuck Obina woke up one cold Saturday morning and realized he could no longer breathe in his own home. He told his best friend that he needed to see something for himself, a truth that lived beyond the marble floors and filtered smiles of the mansion. They stripped away the suits and the security, dressing in plain clothes and taking a single SUV without the fanfare of a billionaire's convoy. Chucks was a man ready for war, but his weapons were observation and memory. When they reached the village hospital, The air smelled once more of dust and distant wood smoke, a scent that acted as a compass to his soul. He sought out the head nurse, the one who had seen his most vulnerable moments. When he asked after the girl who had brought him there, she didn't hesitate. Yes, her name was Chakotay, she told him with a fond smile. She is Chief Joe's niece. She was with you day and night, a sweet, selfless girl. The nurse provided clear directions to Uncle Joe's compound, unaware that she was handing Chucks the key to a massive deception. Chucks felt a knot of pain tighten in his chest as he asked his friend to park far from the gate. He wanted to approach on foot, like the stranger he had been on the day he nearly died. As he walked the final stretch toward the compound, he saw Uncle Joe and Aunt Osa's sitting outside under the shade, sharing a plate of fried chicken and sipping malt drinks with the relaxed air of people who had recently come into money. They did not recognize him in his simple attire. To them, he was just another young man passing through the village. Chucks greeted them politely, his voice steady despite the fire in his eyes. He told them he was looking for a girl named Chakotay, someone who had helped him months ago. The couple looked at each other, confused by the presence of a stranger asking for the girl they had worked so hard to hide. Osa's, ever the dismissive taskmaster, turned her head toward the back of the house and screamed, "Chakotay, you snail, come out here. Someone is looking for you." Then, the door to the outdoor kitchen creaked open. Chakotay stepped out, her silhouette framed by the haze of wood smoke. She wore a faded skirt and an old blouse, her face oily from the heat of frying fish, and her wrapper tied loosely at her waist. She held a wooden spoon in her hand, the very image of the quiet, hard-working soul he remembered. The moment Chuck saw her eyes, his heart skipped a beat. This was her, the posture, the voice, the undeniable aura of quiet bravery that no amount of city makeup could mimic. Chakotay looked at him curiously, her brow furrowing as she offered a gentle evening greeting. She didn't recognize him as the man from the hospital. To her, that stranger was a billionaire who had disappeared in a cloud of dust without a goodbye. Chucks blinked, overwhelmed by the sight of his real savior living in the same squalor he had supposedly rescued her from. "I just came to say thank you for what you did for me months ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." Chakotay looked puzzled, perhaps wondering why a stranger would travel so far to thank a girl whose family treated her like a dustbin. She nodded gently, offering a soft "you're welcome," before turning to walk back into the smoke-filled kitchen. Chucks didn't move. He watched the door close behind her, feeling a sinking, leaden weight in his stomach. He had married the wrong girl. The woman in his mansion was a thief who had stolen the life of a girl who was still working her fingers to the bone for a family that despised her. The walk back to the SUV was the longest of his life. The pain sat heavily on his chest, a combination of rage at the deception and a profound sorrow for the woman he had left behind. He realized now that Osa's and Joe hadn't just switched the girls. They had sold him a lie while keeping the true treasure in servitude. As he sat in the car for the silent ride back to the city, his jaw was tight with a resolve that was cold and absolute. The unannounced return had provided the confirmation he needed. He was no longer a victim of a mistake or a sedated memory. He was a man who knew exactly who had saved him and exactly who had betrayed him. The war for Chakotay's destiny was only just beginning, and Chucks was ready to burn down every lie to see her wearing the crown she had earned. The ride back to the village was not a quiet exploration of truth, but a steady march toward war. Chucks Obinna sat in the back of the SUV, his face a mask of cold fury, while his parents, Mama Loveth and Chief Andrew, sat beside him, their hearts heavy with the weight of a stolen honor. Beside them sat Rita, her eyes swollen from weeping, her face etched with the shame of a woman who had been found out and was now being returned like a piece of rejected cargo. Chucks had made it clear to his household that he would not live another hour with a lie. He had ordered his staff to pack every silk gown and gold trinket Rita had touched and load them into the trunk. As the convoy pulled into Uncle Joe's compound for the final time, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of an impending storm. Uncle Joe and Aunt Osa's were seated under the mango tree, fanning themselves and sipping palm wine, enjoying the fruits of a prosperity they had bought with a lie. They did not expect visitors, certainly not the billionaire family they thought they had successfully deceived. As Chuck's father, Chief Andrew, stepped out of the car, followed by Mama Loveth and Chuck's, the smile died on Uncle Joe's face. Rita stepped out last, her head bowed in disgrace, and the silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. Chuck's didn't wait for a greeting. He pointed a steady finger at Rita and declared to the entire compound that this girl was not his wife and had never been. The confrontation drew the attention of the village almost instantly, neighbors and kindred gathering behind the zinc fences to witness the shattering of a titled man's reputation. Mama Loveth stepped forward, her voice sharp like a blade as she accused Chief Joe of a betrayal that went beyond greed. "You deceived us, Chief," she cried, her voice echoing through the dusty air. "We came for your niece, the one who risked her life, and you handed us your daughter like common thieves." Chief Andrew joined her, his voice booming with the authority of a man who had been mocked. He spoke of the palm wine they had shared and the bride price they had paid in good faith, only to be met with a calculated deception. Aunt Osas, refusing to go down without a fight, stormed forward with her wrapper tight at her waist, her chest heaving with a desperate, ugly rage. She screamed that Chuck's had already vandalized her daughter and that he was obligated to keep her. But Chuck's turned to her with a calm, terrifying rage. He revealed that he had never touched Rita, that he had lived in a separate room and thrown away anything she had even brushed against. At that moment, Chakotay returned from the farm, her cutlass in hand and sweat glistening on her forehead, stopping in her tracks as she took in the chaos. Chuck's turned away from the shouting match and looked directly at the girl in the faded wrapper. "I came to marry you, not your cousin," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the noise like a beacon of truth. "You saved my life, and now I want to give you the life you deserve." The shame began to spread through Uncle Joe's bones as the village elders and kindred began to fill the compound, drawn by the scandal. Chief Andrew made it clear that they would not be mocked and threatened to take the matter to the king and the council of elders if the wrong was not righted immediately. Trapped by his own greed and the weight of his failing honor, Uncle Joe lowered his head, his red cap feeling like a crown of thorns. He stuttered that he would return the bride price, but Chuck's father was unyielding. They were not leaving until the right bride was claimed. Despite Osas's piercing screams of protest, the elders took their seats on long benches, and the marriage list was brought out once more. This time the price was tripled. Goats, cows, and bags of rice were demanded as a penalty for the deception, and Chuck's paid it all on the spot without blinking. When the head elder asked Chakotay if she accepted Chuck's as her husband, she looked into his eyes and saw a truth that held no lies. She whispered her yes in the middle of a compound littered with the wreckage of her aunt's greed. There was no music, no lace, and no expensive catering, only the raw sincerity of a tradition restored. As the setting sun painted the road ahead in gold, Chuck's led Chakotay to the SUV, opening the door for her as if she were a queen. As they drove away into a new chapter, they left behind a weeping Rita and an Uncle Joe buried in a shame too heavy to carry, finally leaving the blood-chilling nightmare of the village for the promise of a city that was waiting to learn her name. The emotional showdown in the village left a lingering silence in its wake, but as Chakotay stepped into the black SUV beside Chuck's, the world around her felt vibrant and alive for the first time in years. One minute she had been a snail, sweeping the compound in the shadow of a wedding she wasn't invited to. The next, she was part of a convoy riding past the very villagers who had once ignored her. As the cars pulled into the sprawling city mansion, Chakotay's eyes widened at the sight of opening gates, blooming flowers, and a line of staff waiting to receive her. She gripped her faded wrapper tighter, her feet hesitant on the shiny marble floors that reflected her weary form like a mirror, until Chuck's gently took her hand and whispered, "Welcome home." The transition from the farm to the city was not an immediate erasure of her past, but a gradual restoration of her soul. In the quiet mornings that followed, Chuck's would find her sitting at the edge of the bed, unsure of how to navigate a life where she wasn't required to cook or clean for her survival. When he asked her what she truly wanted to do with her life, the answer came with a soft, hopeful gaze. She wanted the education that Osas and Joe had stolen from her. Chuck's didn't hesitate. He hired private tutors, built a study room filled with the science books she had once dreamed of, and watched with pride as she studied like her life depended on it. Chakotay's destiny was no longer buried in the dirt of Chief Oiki's farm. After years of being told she was nothing more than a lost goat, she passed her exams with flying colors, sparking a celebration among the household staff who had come to love her quiet grace. Even as she navigated the challenges of a surprise pregnancy, fearing for a moment that her academic dreams might again be deferred, Chucks knelt beside her and promised that they would bring life and knowledge together. 4 years later, she stood in her graduation gown, the sun glinting off her cap as she walked toward the podium to the sound of Chucks and their young son clapping wildly in the front row. But Chakotay's transformation did not end with a degree. Remembering the soil that had once been her place of exile, she told Chucks she wanted to open a farm, not a small plot for survival, but a massive agricultural empire. He bought her hectares of land where she cultivated palm trees, yams, and poultry, managing a team of workers who respected her as Madame Chakotay, the gentle farmer. Despite the wealth and the new title, she never forgot her roots or the debt of kindness she owed Grace. Every month, she sent provisions and money back to the village, ensuring Uncle Joe and Aunt Oses were fed and clothed, even as she maintained a firm boundary to protect her children from their greed. While Chakotay's life bloomed like the gardens of her mansion, Rita found that the bitterness of her deception was a poison that wouldn't leave her blood. After being dropped like a hot coal and humiliated in front of the kindred, the shame had followed her into the city. She eventually married an electrician, a man who treated her well, but she spent her days spitting at the mention of Chakotay's success. To Rita, Chakotay was a thief who had stolen the life that belonged to her, a delusion she clung to even as her own marriage hit the rocks. She could not understand that the crown had always belonged to the girl who was brave enough to suck the venom from a stranger's veins. Back in the mansion, as the evening sun painted the walls in gold, Chakotay rocked her newborn baby beside her husband. She looked at the life they had built, a life of sincerity, education, and restored identity, and realized that she hadn't stolen anything. She had simply claimed the destiny that was written in her sacrifice on the farm path. The void of questions had been replaced by the laughter of her children and the steady love of the man who had looked past the dust to find his true savior. The orphan's burden was finally gone, replaced by the weight of a crown she wore with the quiet strength of a woman who had survived the shadows to find her way home.